Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Memory and Trauma Through History and Culture Migrations Symposium at Simon Fraser University. This two-day event is being hosted by the Department of Humanities and Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for Hellenic Studies with sponsorship from the Institute of the Humanities. The event's organizers include humanities lecturers Irini Kotsovili and Alessandra Capardoni, as well as myself, James Horncastle, an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities, as well as the Edward and Emily McQuinney Professor in International Relations. Before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that all three entities responsible for this event at Simon Fraser University are located on Burnaby Mountain, on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam peoples. The purpose of this symposium was to examine migration in different geographic and historical contexts, specifically to highlight continuities and breaks that exist within the phenomena of migration and to offer political and cultural insights into how migration has and continues to shape our world. Crises seem to have become the status quo of the current century, but perhaps the real crisis is the inability of social discourse to produce concrete analysis beyond a depoliticized humanitarianism and to transform analysis in action. This symposium then poses the question, how can humanities intervene in such discourse? In order to achieve this task, we've assembled 5 panels over the following 2 days that will examine the issue of trauma and memory with regards to migration from a variety of methodological perspectives. It is our hope that not only will this symposium offer political and cultural insights into how migration has and continues to shape our world, but in so doing, establish a dialogic space on the issue. Now, for a bit of housekeeping before we get going, I would like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions or concerns about SFU's Zoom privacy and security guidelines, I would ask you to visit SFU IT Services website, whose link can be found in the same email provided to access this webinar. At the conclusion of each segment of this symposium, we will host a Q&A session. Feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box during the course of the presentations, and we will be sure to address them afterwards. During the Q&A session, if you would like to ask a question verbally, please use the raise your hand button and our event assistant will unmute you. Finally, a reminder to please be kind and respectful. Anyone not adhering to this will be promptly removed. I am now pleased to introduce the moderator for the keynote presentation, Professor Shuyu Kong from the Department of Humanities. Trained in literary and cultural studies, Professor Kong has taught Asian content courses in the Department of Humanities and the Global Asia Program, formerly the Asia Canada Program, since 2008. She also keeps herself busy with bilingual writing and travel studies as a visiting scholar to universities in Asia, Europe, and Australia. So without further ado, I will turn things over to my colleague, Shuyu Kong.
Thank you, James. And thanks to the symposium committee members, Alessandra, Irini, and James for inviting me to take part in this very important and indeed very timely symposium. I'm very honored to introduce our keynote speaker, my colleague, Professor Paul Crowe from the Department of Humanities. Paul's primary area of research is Song and Yuan dynasty traditions of self-cultivation, with a focus on golden elixir alchemy. This entails studies of associated Buddhist and Confucian textual traditions. And his interest in the classical Chinese world has extended to contemporary Chinese religious institutions in Canada relating to migration, religion, and identity. He's also keenly interested in intercultural discussions of ethics and philosophy more broadly, and the European construction of philosophy and religion in the context of Chinese evolving intellectual history. After Paul's talk, we will open up the questions from the audience. So if any of you have questions, please type it into the Q&A box And if I have time, I'll present your questions to Paul. Now, please welcome Professor Crow, who will give us a talk on Chinese exclusion in Canada, the passing and repealing of the 1923 Chinese Immigration Act. Paul.
Thank you very much, Yu. And yes, thanks to the leadership of my colleagues for pulling this symposium together and for inviting me to give a brief talk. I've taken a dangerous step, really, of moving beyond the confines of what I normally study, as you will have heard from what Shuyu said during my introduction. But it was occasioned by work with Chinese communities across Canada through a major project undertaken in the David Lam Center over about a 5-year period. We worked with 5 universities in Canada, civic, provincial, and federal government, and also many Chinese community organizations in Chinatowns from the West Coast all the way out to Montreal. So this was a speech given to about 800 people in a large community event. I was asked to speak on this topic on Canada Day, and I've expanded it into something that I hope will be of interest to you. So why on June 30th, 1923, did the Parliament of Canada, led by Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, give assent to the Chinese Immigration Act, referred to by many now as the Chinese Exclusion Act? In large measure, the answer lies in British Columbia, where intense pressure was exerted from the grassroots level, with their efforts subsequently amplified by provincial politicians. Pressure had begun building more than 4 decades earlier, through the early years of the Fraser Valley Gold Rush, which had commenced in 1858, and then in the years immediately before and continuing through the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, CPR. The CPR was linked to British Columbia's entry into Confederation and represented a much-needed transportation corridor to Eastern Canada, where there was a market for British Columbia's goods and raw materials. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald recognized the economic value of opening a trans-Canada transportation and freight corridor, and he also viewed it as a means for unifying Canada in a way that was both symbolic and practical. Much was invested in this grand infrastructure project, and hopes were high. There were, however, practical limitations impossible to overcome. Where would labor be found to support construction on this unprecedented scale? In 1880, there was an estimated Caucasian population in British Columbia of only 35,000. Out of this population, many able-bodied men were occupied in gold mining, fish canning, coal mining, and various forms of commerce. It was estimated that only 400 Caucasians were actually available, in principle, to serve as laborers for railway construction. In 1879, 2 years before the initial wave of Chinese labor was recruited, Noah Shakespeare, president of the Working Men's Protective Association, later reincarnated as the Anti-Chinese Association, organized a petition signed by 1,500 workers, which Victoria MP Amour de Cosmos, born Bill Smith, actually in Nova Scotia, presented to Parliament in 1879. The petition supported a demand that what Shakespeare referred to as Mongolian labor not be used in constructing the railway. 4 years later, in the midst of an influx of Chinese laborers to BC, during the first session of the 5th Parliament on March 29, 1883, Shakespeare rose, now a member, elected to Parliament, and addressed his parliamentary colleagues in Ottawa as follows. "We are opposed to the Chinese because we find it impossible to compete with them. It's been found to be impracticable in all departments of labor and industry involving manual labor for a white man to compete with a Chinaman." He continues in the same speech. "In British Columbia, the manufacturers as well as the laboring classes are beginning to feel the evil effects of the influx of the Chinese, as the latter can manufacture their own goods more cheaply than white manufacturers." Based on these kinds of observations, though straining, I would say, the dictates of logic, he concludes that white laborers must be supported because "I believe that one white man is as good as half a dozen Chinese any time. I'm sure that today the contractor for the CPR in British Columbia would not employ the Chinese to the extent he does if he had white men there to do his work." After New York businessman Andrew Onderdonk gained most of the contracts for building the BC sections of the CPR, it was determined that 10,000 workers would be required to complete the BC leg of the railway. Clearly, the arguments of Noah Shakespeare were out of touch with the reality of labor needs. Only 400 white men were available for a project that would require backbreaking labor of roughly 10,000, and few of those 400 were willing or able to do the work. Chinese laborers were hired between 1880 and 1881 from the United States, with approximately 1,500 workers coming to BC from San Francisco and Portland. The Lian Chang Company, established by a San Francisco businessman named Li Tinpoi, originally from Toisan County in Guangdong, was the most successful in brokering Chinese labor recruitment from counties in the Pearl River Delta area of Guangdong. In addition to offices in Hong Kong, the Lian Chang Company also had an office in Victoria, one of 2 ports of entry for the Chinese. In June of 1881, 6,676 additional laborers arrived from Hong Kong. According to the 1881 Canadian census, there were only approximately 4,500 Chinese living in all of Canada at that time. So obviously the influx of these laborers was a fairly dramatic event on the West Coast. These workers experienced terrible conditions on their journey. As reported in The Colonist, the main daily newspaper in Victoria at the time, the typical voyage took about 50 days, with each Chinese laborer surviving on 680 grams of rice and 227 grams each of meat and vegetables, with an initial allowance of lime or other fruit juice to stave off problems such as scurvy. This significant wave of Chinese labor recruitment increased racist tensions in British Columbia. While Shakespeare was clearly out of touch with the reality of construction labor needs, he was definitely voicing an opinion that was widely supported. Indeed, in the year prior to making his statement in Parliament, he rode an anti-Chinese wave of rhetoric into the office of mayor in Victoria. Popular support in British Columbia for Chinese exclusion had already come up against reality, expressed in the form of an ultimatum put forward by Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, stating, if you wish to have the railway finished within any reasonable time, there must be no such step against Chinese labor. At present, it simply is a question of an alternative. Either you must have this labor or you cannot have the railway. Much to Mr. Shakespeare's dismay, the reaction to this statement was capitulation. Not completing the railway line was unthinkable for British Columbia's future. Thus, amid much popular resentment, Chinese labor was relied upon very heavily. Based on source documents from the period, historian David Chunyen Lai estimates that by the end of 1882, of the 9,000 railway workers, 6,500 were Chinese. Many of them died due to illness, malnutrition, freezing temperatures, and accidents associated with having to do the most dangerous jobs. For half the pay, I would add. Although Shakespeare's complaints to Parliament in 1883 had not been sufficient to thwart the pragmatic need for labor, his arguments remained compelling 2 years later, after the CPR was completed in 1885. If we look at the transcript of a later section of his earlier speech to Parliament, we find the central point he had made to compel lawmakers far away from British Columbia to reconsider their endorsement of Chinese labor. He had based his argument on an economic threat associated with completion of the railway. After a recess at 6 p.m. on March 29, 1883, Shakespeare made the case that the Chinese could produce goods at cheaper prices than their whiter competitors. He said, many persons of that class, manufacturers, who a short time ago were in favor of admitting the Chinese into British Columbia, and now express themselves decidedly opposed to their admission. As soon as the Pacific Railway is finished through to British Columbia, not only will the Chinese come here themselves, but they will be in a position to bring their manufactured goods into Ontario and other provinces of the Dominion, because they can manufacture them at a cheaper rate than the local manufacturers. To make the case that an Exclusion Act was a safe bet politically, he mentioned the fact that in British Columbia, only a few days earlier, a resolution had already passed unanimously in the local legislature to urge the Dominion government to restrict Chinese immigration. Further, under the Welcome administration, he adds, an order was passed that no Chinese should be employed in any way by the local governments. And from that day to the present, I do not believe that a single solitary Chinaman has had $1 from that government, the BC government. BC Premier George Anthony Waltham supported racist policies and laws during his term in office. Quoting from volume 13 of the University of Toronto's Dictionary of Canadian Biography, it says, in addition to passing the province's first explicitly racist statute, which denied Chinese and Native people the vote, his government took a comparatively hard line on the size of Indian reserves that were to be set aside for the province pursuant to the terms of union. By referencing the situation in British Columbia, Shakespeare was demonstrating the high degree of public will in support of actions against the Chinese. He also cited actions taken in California, where exclusion had recently been enacted. Of course, this set a useful precedent for the decision makers of the Dominion and provided motivations to act. As he further explained, the California lawmakers had now made British Columbia what he called, quote, a dumping place for the Pacific coast, the place where the Chinese are dumped, close quote. He also urged that Canada adopt an approach to Chinese exclusion based in part on a model adopted in Australia, specifically in New South Wales, where in 1881, a poll tax of £10 was instituted. In 1888, that poll tax was raised to £100. Interestingly, 29 years before the Dominion of Canada would finally abandon its own head tax, there appeared a letter to the editor in the Brisbane Courier dated Monday, November 31, 1894. That letter demonstrated how in Australia, the head tax had largely failed to reduce the population of Chinese in the colony. Detailing immigration and emigration statistics between 1871 and 1893, the writer explained that while there was a high level of Chinese outward migration prior to the poll tax, once it had been instituted, outward migration fell off very dramatically. He argued that moving to the colony for a Chinese now meant an investment of £100, and this was a great incentive for them to stay and make the hardship of such a large investment worth their while. Clearly, this information concerning failure of the head tax in Australia had not made it to the Dominion of Canada, where due to pressure from British Columbia, a head tax of $50 was introduced in 1885, immediately upon construction of the railway, of course. It was then raised from $50 to $100 in 1901, and by 1903, it was up to $500. Near the turn of the century, and here I'm relying on figures from David Chunyan Lai again, quote, the average Chinese laborer could earn only $225 a year. After deducting food, clothing, rent, medicine, and other expenses, he could save only $43 a year. Despite the considerable hardship represented by such a high payment, the pay for labor in Canada was still 10 to 20 times higher than it was in the towns and villages of the Sayap, the counties in the Pearl River Delta. Thus, the influx of Chinese desperate to succeed and support families back home continued. After raising the head tax twice, the Chinese Immigration Act, assented to on June 30th, 1923, was viewed as the only recourse for completely stopping the tide of Chinese migration. In its original format, the Act is 15 pages in length, and contrary to popular opinion, nowhere does the Act actually explicitly state that no Chinese will be permitted to enter the Dominion. The Act defines a Chinese immigrant as follows. A Chinese immigrant means any person of Chinese origin or descent entering Canada for the purpose of acquiring Canadian domicile as defined by Section 2, Paragraph D of the Immigration Act. While the text of the Act provides a lengthy list of reasons not to admit Chinese immigrants, its intent certainly appears to have been refusal to admit any would-be immigrants of Chinese geographic or ancestral origin. Three classes were accepted in Section 5 of the Act: members of the diplomatic corps, children who had been born in Canada, and merchants and foreign students for the duration of their studies. All decisions were subject to approval of the minister, and what he decided was final. Thus, there were no checks and balances to counter arbitrary or unreasonable decisions taken by the minister, and no right of appeal. Entry points into the Dominion was specified as Victoria and Vancouver. So this provided a high level of control for immigration officials who had only two key ports of entry to monitor. Of course, it was not the minister who stood at the port of entry ready to evaluate newcomers as to their worthiness for entry. It was individuals empowered through the Act as controllers and defined in Section 2, subsection C as the immigration or other officer controller at any seaport or frontier port of entry duly appointed as such and charged with the duty of assisting in carrying out the provisions of this act into effect. Under section 10, the powers of these controllers is defined as follows. The controller shall have authority to determine whether an immigrant, passenger, or other person seeking to enter or land in Canada or detained for any cause under this act is of Chinese origin or descent, and whether such immigrant, passenger, or other person, if found to be of Chinese origin or descent, shall be allowed to enter, land, or remain in Canada, or shall be rejected and deported. The Act is careful to stipulate that such evaluations shall not be undertaken in a public setting, but rather in a space controlled by the officer, and in the company of only those the officer permits to be present. Thus, from the ministerial level down to the front lines at the port of entry, there was no safeguard against arbitrary decisions, and indeed the Act in large measure ensured the preservation of this unjust process away from public eye and removed from due process. While the Chinese Immigration Act does not state that no Chinese will be admitted, the immigration officers were given plenty of opportunity to legitimately deny entry. 3 classes could be admitted, while no fewer than 15 classes were denied entry. Many of these were very vague and by definition open to the officer's interpretation. Included, for example, were persons considered to have been considered to what we would call today having mental health problems. In 19th century language, the feeble-minded, imbeciles, or people who had been deemed insane at any time in their lives. Also, people who had any form of health problems described as, quote, loathsome diseases. No appeal was permitted for anyone denied entry on the basis of mental health problems. Also included were women coming to Canada for any so-called immoral purpose, beggars, vagrants, anyone the controller thought might become a public charge, chronic alcoholics, and finally, of course, anyone who could not read English or French. An interesting echo of Noah Shakespeare is in the particular detail in the Act that restricts transportation of Chinese to the Dominion. Shakespeare had mentioned in his 1883 speech to Parliament that the Australians had a rule in their Immigration Act stipulating that only 1 Chinese person could be carried per 100 tons of tonnage of any ship, with fines for companies who broke this rule. The Chinese Immigration Act in Canada was far more harsh, ruling that only 1 Chinese person per 250 tons could be carried on board. So in concrete terms, a very large ocean liner, such as, for example, the Empress of China that journeyed regularly between Hong Kong and Canada during the early 1900s, with a capacity of 600 passengers weighing 5,905 tons, would mean that of 600 passengers, a maximum of only 23 could be Chinese. So clearly then, although the Chinese Immigration Act did not explicitly and systematically deny entry to Chinese, that was precisely the result. In fact, during the period of exclusion from 1923 to 1947, the estimate is that only roughly 15 individuals made it through this screening process. Many Chinese in Canada had to endure the terrible hardship as a result of separation from their family members in China. The 1941 census reported that about 47% of Canada's 34,627 Chinese lived in 5 metropolitan cities. These were Vancouver, Victoria, Toronto, Montreal, and Winnipeg. Over 90% of the metropolitan Chinese population resided in and near Chinatowns in a state of segregation. It was during this period that Dominion Day, what we now call Canada Day, was referred to as the Day of Shame by the Chinese in Canada, who, up until at least 1930, reserved that date for high-profile public protest and community discussions of the Immigration Act. After the outbreak of the European War in September 1939, the governments of British Columbia and Saskatchewan in particular strongly opposed enlisting the Chinese in the armed forces, fearing that they would demand to be enfranchised after the war. Despite opposition, many native-born Chinese youths volunteered for military service to prove their loyalty to Canada, although they were not treated as Canadian soldiers. It was only after Japan entered the war that the British started to recruit Chinese to infiltrate and fight behind Japanese lines in China, Sarawak, and Malaya. After they were finally granted entry into the Canadian Armed Forces, over 600 Chinese did serve in World War II. Despite their bravery and willingness to sacrifice so much for a country that had still refused to give them the vote, it was not until 1947 After protracted protests, appeals to local politicians and to parliament organized by Chinese clan and regional associations and by veterans, that the Chinese Immigration Act was finally repealed. And that was under considerable debate in the House of Commons, intense debate. So finally, the Chinese could vote in federal elections, 1947. While it would be heartening to think that the Canadian government finally recognized the terrible injustices imposed on Chinese immigrants, it appears that in combination with internal pressures brought to bear by Chinese veterans and Chinese community associations, external circumstances also forced Canada's hand. In the wake of the horrors perpetrated during the Second World War, including the genocidal campaign waged by the Nazis on European Jews, world leaders felt an urgent need to enshrine the rights of individuals on a more global and universal level that would hold nations to account. After the Second World War, Canada, as a founding member of the UN, became a signatory to the United Nations Charter, adopted unanimously in San Francisco, June 26, 1945, and later the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, proclaimed by the UN General Assembly in Paris, December 10, 1948. Significantly, of course, McGill law professor John Peters Humphrey had established the Division for Human Rights in the UN Secretariat and is credited with the first draft of the Declaration of Human Rights. So plainly and embarrassingly, as a signatory, Canada would be in contravention of these newly adopted universal rights by virtue of its own systematically racist immigration policies. Thus, in 1947, the Chinese finally gained the right to vote and participate in the governance of a country to which they'd already contributed so much. Despite this positive development, the Chinese continued to be treated unfairly, as is illustrated, for example, by Ordering Council PC 2115, to which men could, in theory, appeal to bring their wives and children from China to Canada. According to the Ordering Council, entrance would be limited to spouses of naturalized Chinese. But in 1947, fewer than 10% of Chinese qualified as citizens, thus rendering the Ordering Council pretty useless for 90% of the people who would need that act to bring that Ordering Council in order to bring their relatives to Canada. In 1947, Prime Minister Mackenzie King continued to reiterate the message that Canadian citizens would not relish a wave of Asian migration. Arguments were put forward for a quota on Chinese immigration. The real turning point had to wait until the introduction of the point system of immigration, which wasn't adopted until 1967 under the Trudeau administration. All right, that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for giving us an interesting survey of the Chinese Immigration Act and its context. Your talk provides a very useful historical and a local reference point for our discussion of memory and trauma, migration, and diaspora in history and all over the world. In a moment, I will open up the discussion for questions from the audience. I just checked. So if any of you have a question, please type it into the type the questions into this Q&A box. You should see it at the bottom, on the screen. To start the ball rolling, I will ask a question myself. Okay, Paul. While we're waiting for more questions to come up, maybe. You tell us a lot about the content of the Act, the Chinese Immigration Act, and the main forces that pushed through that Act, and the historical context. Often the impact of the legal changes become clearer when we read the stories about the lives and the experience of the regular people caught up in the political and the social changes. Are there any books, memoirs, or literary works that you would recommend for us to understanding that impact, the impact of this discriminatory, laws and racist attitude on ethnic Chinese individuals or families, which I understand is extended through generations and both psychologically and materially?
Yeah, I can't speak specifically to memoirs, but what I would recommend is the work of BC historian Patricia E. Roy, who's written several books and published through UBC Press. They give a very finely grained set of details on the kind of social dynamics that were experienced by individuals on the ground affected by this legislation. And another individual to whom I referred in my paper is David Chunyan Lai, who's sadly passed away not so long ago, and with whom I worked on a Chinese Canadian history project through the David Lamb Center. He too has written a lot on the social dynamics within the clan associations, the family and regional associations that actually took such a leadership role through the difficult years during which time the Exclusion Act was in effect. And I think one of the weaknesses of what I just presented is it tends to, because it does focus so much on the act, it's tempting to see the Chinese communities affected as perhaps somewhat passive recipients of this injustice. But of course, they were very vocal. They fought back. They had agency. They were continually protesting and making presentations to government, both provincial and federal, pressing the need to review this unjust situation and to basically restore or to give Chinese proper place in Canada. So those are two authors I would suggest immediately if you want to get a real sense of some of the grassroots effects.
Yeah. Yes, I remember Professor Lai. You know, he worked with us. That was in the early 2010s, right? And the reason I asked this question, I also thought, as you said, you know, it's when you're talking about this Chinese Immigration Act, we tend to know what all this policymaker, the white Canadians, think at that time, and how about those people who were impacted, and those voices, and very important for, you know, later for this head tax redress movement, and led to the eventually the apology from the government, right? All the changes. So that is also very important, and also talking about these people's voice, and also talking about the related with our symposium. I think some panels try to focus on the, you know, the memories, those life writings from those people who were impacted. And I think when we're talking about this, when we look at back there's 100 years history, like and there was lots of tons of memoirs and also literature, and recently documentary made. I came across a documentary. Actually, I like to recommend to you all. This documentary is made by Kanda Gee, and the title of the documentary is "Lost Years: A People's Struggle for Justice." And Kanda himself is Chinese Canadian, and in that documentary, this is he spent I think over 10 years to make, and he with his father went back to China, and also they went to Australia, New Zealand, as you mentioned. All those are, you know, connected, and in some ways some of the experience was shared, and that documentary really gave lots of give the interviews, give all this people's the statement how those Immigration Act impacted their life and left those trauma. Generations have to learn how to overcome and to recover from it. Yeah, and also give this still this kind of struggle, this to give voices still going on. Thanks. And let me just check the question. Yes, Sergio? Yes, yep. Please.
Good afternoon. Professor, in 1947, Canada repealed the Chinese Immigration Act, and in 1967, as you said, the immigration restrictions on the basis of race and national origin were finally removed. So I was wondering if you could spend some words on this hiatus period, 1947-1967. Did it favor interethnic marriages in BC as a sort of rebound phenomenon? Do we have data about such a phenomenon?
Yeah, I don't know about data on interracial marriages in the period between 1947 and 1967 in Canada. And actually, I would say what you're dealing with is continued, a protracted period of the government isolating Chinese communities or resisting integration of Chinese into so-called mainstream Canadian society. Even if we look at, for example, for me, I'm interested in religious studies, I'm interested in religious institutions in Canada. You do not find Taoist or Buddhist temples, Chinese Taoist Buddhist temples during this period. It's much later that begins to happen. There's too much fear around being noticed. Putting your culture, your identity forward in any kind of bold manner that would threaten your position. It was very much keeping your head down on the religious front. You see this with Japanese Canadians. There were Buddhists here, actually. There were Japanese Canadian Buddhists here much earlier, but they too adopted they adopted the architecture of churches. They had pews, they had hymnals in their pews. So it was much more a sense of trying to fit in. The abiding message really was all the way through the early 60s was your mission as a Canadian citizen is really not to become Canadian, but to be British, to represent all of the British past culturally and to embody that in the Dominion. I think the census there was a census in 1960, 61, where we see that 96+% of the population was of European origin. So another factor in terms of isolation is just the tiny percentage of individuals that were Chinese at that time. And as David Lai's research has shown, half of those Chinese were within Chinatowns. I have extended family members who came from the Four Counties area of southern China to the West Coast in the early 1900s, who their kids later on couldn't speak English. If you go into Chinese associations, join seniors playing mahjong. I'm talking people in their 80s. Many of them still have very little facility with English. It's it's a leftover from this period of isolation, geographic isolation in Chinatowns, which of course began to fade away post 67. That really began to shift as people moved out into the suburbs. Businesses were always there, but there was a greater confidence. Intermarriage. Sorry, I can't tell you.
You've been already extremely informative. Thank you so much for your explanation.
Thanks. Stephen, I see you have a question?
Sure, if there's time, although it might be fairly straightforward. Thanks, Paul. Enjoyed the talk. Were you suggesting near the end there sort of a causal relationship between the end of the Chinese Immigration Act and the kind of discourse and discussions around human rights at the UN post-World War II leading up to the UDHR? Is that what, do you see those? It sound like you're saying they're connected.
There's a suggestion that on the world stage, that would have been a very embarrassing move to have maintained such an obviously racist approach to immigration. And also I tried to account for the fact that a huge amount of push was coming from Chinese veterans, from clan and regional organizations that still, if you go down to Pender Street today, you can see those association buildings standing. The benevolent associations, right? The Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association was a kind of umbrella organization that, well, it mediated disputes sometimes. It kind of, it had the capacity, because it was represented by so many associations, to represent itself to government. They too were pushing. So there's a causal connection. I think there is I would agree that there's a causal connection between the position Canada was trying to take on the world stage and this, combined with a push within Canada against this act, it kind of came together at a moment when I think the Chinese government had very little choice but to back down. But my point is that it wasn't a revelation. This wasn't a, an awakening moment at all. It was grudgingly made. It was made in the context of tremendous debate. And every step of the way, roadblocks were put up to inhibit Chinese migration, Chinese movement, Chinese activities in Canada. So it wasn't by any means a moment to celebrate for any great length. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I just checked, there's one question from Arini. She was wondering, is there an archive here, I guess in Vancouver, with testimonials, not just records from that period, Paul?
UBC actually had maintained, I don't know if it's still online, but I'm sure there must be access still to it, but UBC had a collection of stories, videos, stories that people had told of their experiences. I can get the information for you offline later if you like. Also, of course, SFU has a tremendous collection of digitized newspapers, which really are an incredibly rich resource, which I did not use for this. With 20 minutes, I don't have time to get into that level of detail, but there's a huge amount of detail available online, right down to daily ads. What were people purchasing? What were the headlines? What were the main concerns? What were the disputes between different actors in the various segments of the Chinese community, which was quite heterogeneous, and at times there were confrontations and conflicts. Hence, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, part of its role was to mediate those. So you can get a look at some of the finer dynamics through that archive at SFU, and then the personal stories that are recorded and available through UBC. And as I say, I can get information on both of those for you later.
Thank you, Paul. Is there any more questions? We are just 1 minute left, and I think we'll conclude this keynote speech section. Thank you again, Paul, for a very informative talk, and I'll pass this to James.
All right, thank you both, Shuyu and Paul. Very informative talk, Paul. Thank you, and thank you, Shuyu, for moderating. That was great insight they provided with your question as well. So now moving on, I would like to move on to the next panel and introduce the moderator for panel number 1, Julian Brooks. Julian Brooks is a faculty member of the Department of History at Douglas College in Metro Vancouver. He holds a PhD in history from Simon Fraser University. His research interests have been in diplomacy, humanitarian intervention, and peacekeeping in the Balkans and the Middle East. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Julian.
Okay, well, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to panel number 1, Migrations in Modern History. Seems we have 3 papers this afternoon. We'll go from Central Europe into and through Southeastern Europe, which should prove to be extremely interesting, I'm sure. As per the schedule, I will introduce each panelist, and then they will give their paper. Then I'll introduce the next panelist, and so on. And when we get to the end, after the third panelist, we'll open the floor to questions from the audience, either through raising your hand or via the Q&A function. And I'll remind our panelists to please limit your papers to 15 minutes. All right. First up is Lauren Faulkner Rossi. Lauren, are you there? I see instructions to have video on.
Yes, I'm here.
Excellent. Okay, so just to quickly introduce you then, Lauren Faulkner Rossi, our first presenter, is a limited term assistant professor at Simon Fraser University. Her first book, Wehrmacht Priest, explores the motivations of German Catholic priests and seminarians who were conscripted into the military during the Second World War. In 2017, she co-edited Lessons and Legacies 12, New Directions in Holocaust Research and Education with Wendy Lower. She is currently working on revising the 4th edition of Martin Kitchen's History of Modern Germany, forthcoming in 2022, and assisting a Holocaust child survivor to write her memoirs. Her presentation this afternoon is entitled Children of Silence, Child Survivors of the Holocaust and Remembering as Trauma.
Thank you, Julian. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, coming through fine, thanks.
Excellent. And thank you to Paul as well for a really informative, really enlightening keynote. I quite enjoyed that, Paul. Thank you. Of the 6 million Jews killed by the Nazis during World War II, scholars now accept that as many as 1.5 million were children or adolescents under the age of 18. Only 11% of Jewish children who were alive in Europe in 1939 lived to see 1945. In the vast literature of Holocaust historiography, the voices of these children have tended to be faint, peripheral, or non-existent. If we say that a language of trauma emerged many years after the war, which older survivors created and used to relate their stories to an increasingly receptive audience, then child survivors took even longer, many, many decades, to join this conversation. Recently, this trend has changed. Scholars have begun to include the testimony of child survivors, and a growing number of published memoirs have brought sustained attention to their contributions to many well-established fields, including Holocaust studies, psychology, and the history of trauma, among others. As historians continue to engage with eyewitness testimony in innovative and exciting ways, and as the last survivors of the Holocaust, all of those now alive are child survivors, pass on, old questions about history and memory, displacement and identity, and remembering and trauma have come to have renewed significance and urgency for all individuals invested in preserving the lessons of the Holocaust. In the brief time that I have this afternoon, I would like to discuss some central components of what child survivors bring to our understanding of the Holocaust. I will touch briefly on displacement and migration, but my primary focus today is on how memory informs the identity of child survivors, the nature of their testimony, and their navigation of traumatic memory, a double-edged sword, not my term, that is inherent to the act of remembering. Each of these subjects deserves intensive analysis on its own, so my introductory remarks today are designed to foster dialogue rather than pronounce fixed conclusions. I base my comments primarily on my collaboration with one child survivor in particular, whose memoirs I'm assisting in writing. No historian comes to her topic as a blank slate, but I have specific vested interests in these questions and wish to acknowledge them at the outset. More than 20 years ago, Dominic LaCapra asserted, especially for victims, trauma brings about a lapse or rupture in memory that breaks continuity with the past, thereby placing identity in question to the point of shattering it. LaCapra is an acknowledged master of the themes of history, memory, and trauma. He wrote several books on the subject, including one that bears that exact title. But I do not doubt that he was not thinking in particular of children when he penned that sentence. The trauma of genocide is substantial for all who endure it. It interrupted or obliterated childhoods and lives, it shattered families, and it introduced its victims to malnourishment, deprivation, separation, and abandonment. But children suffered uniquely. If we accept that memories are a major factor in the shaping of one's identity, then a child born shortly before or during the war may have no memories at all of that period, at least not for conscious recall. But this does not diminish the effects of the war and genocide, nor their profound impact on the shaping of that child's identity. Slightly older children may have some memory of a pre-war family or home, but only as glimpses, often out of sequence, without broader meaning or relevance. Again, the impact this has on identity formation can be severe and not necessarily in the way that LeCapra means. For many child survivors, there was no fixed identity in place to shatter. For others who survived in hiding, which frequently involved being placed in foreign environments, entirely dependent on the goodwill of strangers, their childhood identity is entrenched within and maybe even inextricable from these early memories of staying silent, staying anonymous, hidden away, and using an assumed name. I don't know how that child did it, Marie said to me one afternoon this past summer. She was talking about herself in a rare moment of using the third person. She was 5 years old and known as Mariette when the German armies invaded her home, Brussels, Belgium. She was 10 when they were finally defeated and 12 when she migrated to Canada. She doesn't remember her father and has some very vivid memories of her mother, from whom she was separated initially in 1941 and then permanently in 1943. She survived in hiding, which involved considerable displacement. She moved from place to place, usually at the direction of an older brother. At least 2 of them and an older sister were involved in the organized resistance to Nazism. She was specifically instructed when she was first moved to a convent in 1941 not to learn anyone's name, not to make friends with anyone, and never to change her own name. She was never in a camp, so her experiences are qualitatively different than camp survivors, as is the nature of her testimony. In 1984, Marie consented to be interviewed about her experience by the Vancouver Holocaust Center Society as part of their fledgling survivor testimony collection. She was herself a co-founder of the society a year before. This 2-hour videotaped interview was the first time she had spoken publicly, that is, not to a member of her family, about her childhood in Europe. She gave another videotaped interview in 2010. Both interviews follow the same format. Marie told her story piece by piece in response to interviewer questions. Some answers were factual and relatively painless for her to give. She was born in Brussels in 1935. She was the youngest of 11 siblings, 8 of whom survived the war, and she came to Canada in 1947 with 3 of those surviving siblings. She struggled with other responses because of gaps in her memory. She could not say how her father died. She remembered very little about the orphanages and convents and the nuns that helped to hide her, although she could describe in great detail the dress and the veil of the Mother Superior. She could not remember much of the period between 1945 and 1947, so the ages of 10 to 12, when she was still in Belgium and apparently recovering from wartime illness and filling out immigration applications. And some memories were clearly very painful, even if they were fragmentary, partial, or incomplete, as she and I later discovered. I should say inaccurate, actually. The last time she saw her mother, on a street corner in Brussels, she witnessed her and an older brother bundled into a truck by the Gestapo. She later discovered that they were interned briefly at a transit camp in Mechelen, Belgium, before being taken to Auschwitz, where they were killed. For decades after, she believed that this event happened on her birthday, May 10th, 1942, and she refused to allow her husband and her daughters to celebrate it. Only when she and I began to research the fates of her mother and siblings earlier this year to more accurately contextualize her story, did she discover that her mother was arrested in July of 1943. So this is only one example of a child of 8 watching her mother torn from her life in a moment of incredible brutality and finality. There are many others, each of which have helped me comprehend more completely how Marie's memory of Mariette works to inform her identity, both who she was as a child and who she is now. What she remembers from 80 years ago is often astounding. Some of the scenes she describes are as detailed as if they happened to her yesterday. As she recounted her story in the 1984 interview, she came to the realization, literally in the middle of answering a question, that her siblings had employed her near photographic memory during the war and used her as a kind of courier for the resistance. Again, she was only about 7, 8, 9 years old. They did this because she knew multiple languages, having grown up in a multilingual household in a bilingual country. She grew up speaking Polish, Yiddish, French, and Flemish interchangeably, and then learned German, Dutch, and Swedish during the war for the purposes of relaying messages. In this manner, migration was a key component of her survival story because she traveled extensively in war-torn Europe, from France and the Low Countries to Luxembourg and Germany, and apparently even as far as Sweden. Bear in mind, as I've said, she was a child as young as 6 when she began to do this. She did not understand what was happening and would not have known words like displacement or migration, but clearly her experience of these terms was a formative part of her childhood. On the other hand, these memories are now 75 to 80 years old and bear all the predictable challenges. She also listened well to her older brother when he told her not to remember names. So she cannot remember any cities where she went, save for the Belgian cities that she knew of as home, and Paris, where her older sister lived before the war. She doesn't remember any of the messages she passed on or the logistics of how she got from place to place, though she does insist and remembers that she traveled by train, by bus, by motorbike in a sidecar, and on foot, and that she was sometimes with an older brother, and that she learned from him how to jump from moving trains and how to fall without hurting herself. And this is how her memories work. They come in flashes, like snapshots or fragments, only rarely connected to each other. When I press her to elaborate on this, she continues, "You know how you scrape the wall as a child when you're bored and there's nothing to do? Those are memories. You scratch and it gets deeper and deeper and deeper, and you go back to those memories that you didn't know were there." She doesn't always know how to process these memories or how to arrange them in sequence. Until she began working with me, many of these memories drifted loosely, like photos without captions. At a different point, she tells me, remembering is a ripple effect, like throwing a stone into the water. Writing her memoirs has encouraged her to confront these ripples and try to make some sense of them, or at least to find an order where before she had no impulse to do so. Trying to remember for herself and for her memoirs is an emotionally arduous and often unsatisfactory experience for Marie. And at times I feel like I am witnessing and perhaps even instigating an intense struggle to recapture a memory that she has deliberately suppressed for decades. This is Robert Krell's double-edged sword, in which a child survivor is caught between wanting desperately to remember, but also wanting just as strongly to forget. She spent a significant part of the war living on the streets, which she said were crowded with thousands of children just like her. Perhaps not Jewish necessarily, but certainly none of the children had any safe alternative to go to. She can only vaguely recall the families with whom she stayed. They are bodies without names or faces, as she describes, and she acknowledges their heroic deed of sheltering a Jew at a time when that act meant certain death if caught, but follows this with the reminder that they were all very well paid, including the convents. She was never allowed to eat at the same table as their children, was never shown affection, and was scolded when she became interested in school books that their children happened to leave lying around. From the age of 5 to the age of 13, I'll remind you, she was never in school. In fact, she only returned to school when she settled in Vancouver with her foster family. Marie recognizes that the large gaps in her story are problematic, and in my view, this, in addition to how painful remembering can be, has been responsible for her reluctance to pen her memoirs. Despite this, she has never flagged in her determination to finish the project, even if the gaps remain unresolved. She is anxious to share her truth, she says, even if she cannot always make it fit properly with the truth. Incidentally, she told me that many other child survivors with whom she speaks regularly have also taken on this project of writing their memoirs for the first time, a project that in no small way has been spurred by the current pandemic. Marie migrated to Canada in late 1947 and came to Vancouver in early 1948. This migration from Brussels to London, then across the Atlantic to Halifax, and then across the country to the Pacific coast is as significant a part of her identity as her European childhood. She remembers arriving with dozens of other children on Pier 21 in Halifax, where she was treated like an alien. She was 12, where she could sense the fear and unease of the customs officials and where she and other Jewish refugees were promptly plundered of the little money and valuables that they had brought with them from Europe. She explained to me that she had some, quote, black market money, end of quote, and a baby ring with a diamond, the only thing really that she had left from her family. The customs agents took it all with no explanation, except for the gold band of the ring, which was handed back to her without the diamond. She is representative of many child survivors of genocide in this aspect of her post-war story and the development of two selves. She and so many others had to survive her survival, part of which required finding a new identity for herself, an identity with roots in displacement. She intentionally became Marie in 1948. When she speaks to high school students about her childhood, she reverts to Mariette. In fact, she uses this name for her speaking engagements. Mariette, the silent child in hiding, entirely self-sufficient, a robot, her word, not mine, for whom Marie speaks. And when she finishes, she returns to life as Marie, the successful businesswoman and community outreach worker, wife and mother and grandmother. Mariette goes on the shelf until the next time she is needed, Marie explains, to tell the story of the child she tried to leave unsuccessfully behind in Europe. In closing, I would like to remark on Marie's purpose of going through the act of remembering, even if it is traumatic, and on my purpose in asking her to do so. Our goals were distinct, or so I thought until I began to give it some thought. For Marie, this is her opportunity in her 85th year to write about her life, a story that she has had in her head for decades, and parts of which she has shared with high school students. She is compelled to do this for her family, her daughters and her grandchildren, so that they know where they come from and who their family was. This motivates her to confront what she calls the little pieces of a child's memory that still hurt. For me, I have been struck from the beginning by the uniqueness of Marie's story of survival, first of the Holocaust and then of her coming to Canada to renewed discrimination and hardship. I have come to believe, as a historian, that eyewitness testimony, particularly from survivors, is an essential component to the writing of the history of any genocide. Conventionally, such evidence has been treated by historians with reluctance due to its highly subjective, inaccurate, and therefore allegedly unreliable nature. But historian Omer Baratov has recently shone light on the significance of eyewitness testimony, particularly from victims and survivors, when he insists so much of what actually occurs during a genocide, as well as how such occurrences are experienced, has been entirely missing from the official documentation. By writing their voices back into the narrative, we are allowed to, and I quote, observe a world far removed and different from our own through a unique personal prism, thereby enabling us to understand how people not much unlike ourselves responded to mass violence and destruction, end of quote. I know Marie has long pursued these goals, and I am honored that she has chosen to work with me to extend her reach and the lessons offered by her life experiences to a larger audience. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Very powerful story. Thank you. I'm sure we'll have. I've got questions, but we better hold those till later. So we'll have to keep rolling along here. Stevan Bosanic is up next. Stevan, are you there, please, just to make sure? And could you turn your camera on?
Hello.
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 There you are. Okay. Good to go. Okay. Our next panelist is Stevan Bosanic. He's a PhD candidate in the history program at Simon Fraser University. His dissertation looks at the relationship between ideology and mass violence amongst paramilitary groups. Specifically, it examines a Serbian nationalist organization which operated during the Second World War in Yugoslavia, the Chetniks. The dissertation seeks to know how their choice to collaborate with the Axis invaders may have influenced decisions to perpetuate mass violence against ethnic Croatian and Bosnian Muslim civilians. His presentation today is entitled Mobilized Memories of Displacement and Violence. Stevan, over to you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen here. And there we go. Yeah, so my talk today is entitled Mobilized Memories of Displacement and Violence. And essentially, I'm using the case study of Croatian Serbs. My main argument essentially is that they have a unique nationalist identity separate from that of what we would consider the Serbian state nationalism. So really, my talk is focused on the 1990s and the war that occurred in Yugoslavia at that point. But really, one of the cruxes of this unique Serbian identity really comes with the migration of the Serbs to the Habsburg lands in the late 17th century in 1690 and 1691. So this famous picture here is the migration of the Serbs depicting this event. And essentially this moment here, there are two interpretations of this particular event. In one interpretation, the Serbs were invited by the emperor of the Habsburg Empire to Croatia to help defend the border region against the Ottoman Empire. In a second interpretation, the Serbs fled the Ottoman oppression as refugees and settled in the Habsburg territories. They were granted permission to stay only after their arrival. But at any rate, the settling of Serbs in Croatian territory led to the existence of a population that spoke and understood the language of the locals, but who worshipped in the Christian Orthodox Church as opposed to the Catholic Church. Their alphabet was Cyrillic and not Latin, and their ways of life differed from the locals. These practical and semantic differences set them apart from the local Croatian populations. Now, for reference here, I have a map of the Habsburg Empire from about 1700, so right about the time that the Serbs would have migrated. But these migrations brought an estimated 30 to 40,000 Serbs to the empire. In one understanding, they kept guard on the border regions as highwaymen or bandits, known locally as Haiduks, and what Eric Hobsbawm famously called social bandits. And so it's partially this identity then of a social bandit, which has permeated into the nationalist imagination down into the 1990s in the Yugoslav wars of succession that took place, and even permeate further into today. So the other strand here that this argument sort of rests on is the existence of the Second World War and the genocide essentially that was being undertaken by the independent state of Croatia, or the NDH, against ethnic Serbs in Croatian territory. Now, the NDH was intent on ridding this extended Croatian territory of ethnic Serbs and began a campaign of slaughter and extermination, which later became attempts at conversion and ethnic cleansing, sort of scale back. Well, the areas which saw the most resistance on the part of the Serbs, mainly in Dalmatia and Herzegovina, this sort of borderland region, were also amongst the first areas targeted in 1941 by the NDH for extermination. Now, skipping ahead here a little bit into the 1990s, we see the creation of this independent republic, the Republic of Serbia and Krajina, which existed roughly from 1991 to 1995. So much research has gone into sort of looking at the influences of the Second World War on the Yugoslav wars of succession in the 1990s, specifically how they relate to the Serbs. But this paper couples this research of the Second World War influence with the nationalist rhetoric surrounding the ethnic Serbs of Croatia. So in 1990, the ethnic Serbs rebelled against the Croatian government, and well into 1991, variably argued for autonomy, independence, or union with Serbia proper. The entity of the Republic of Serbia and Krajina was declared in 1991, which is seen in the red areas of the map. And it was the memories of both the Second World War and the initial migrations of Serbs to Croatia which fueled the initial resistance and their own eventual campaign of ethnic cleansing and genocide against ethnic Croats and other non-Serbs. So essentially then it's the memory of both the migrations and the creation of this unique identity and this memory from the Second World War, which sort of melded together into this unique identity and into this unique experience then of rebellion as well as revenge against their Croatian neighbors. So one example that I'd like to put forward here, given time, I'm only using one example, but I could go on for hours on this. But one example from the 1990s is using the pop music, which has since come to be called turbo folk music. But essentially, this version of pop music was popular amongst the Serbian nationalists, especially those from the Krajina borderlands in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, the so-called military frontier. And one popular singer at the time was known as Baja Mali Kninja. And essentially his name, the Kninja, translates as Little Knin Ninja. Knin being the capital of the Serbian entity in Krajina. And ninja, of course, Japanese ninja. So it's a kind of a multilingual pun there. And so the Baja here became infamous or famous in some circles for using racial slurs against Croats and Bosnian Muslims. So as we see from the title of this particular cassette tape, where he refers to Bosnian Muslims as Pashas, of course, harkening back to the Ottoman Empire, and Ustashas, harkening back to calling Croats Ustashas from the Second World War. So in his heyday in the 1990s, he was often seen in fatigues, as we see him here in this cassette cover, and quite often emblazoned with Serbian nationalist imagery, whether it was, the cross and four C's or skull and crossbones from the Chetniks of the Second World War, or, other sort of images. And one particular video sort of caught my eye when I was researching a few different things here. And honestly, if it hadn't been so morbid as, the content of the song, the video itself would actually be kind of funny. But essentially this song, it translates as shut up, uncle, I will kill you. With uncle, ujko, the term meaning is essentially a nickname for Croats. And so through this video, Baja rambles through the bushes and, kind of skips over ponds and things. And he looks for uncles to kill, ethnic Croats to kill. And so from a personal experience, Baja's songs were popular amongst Croatian Serb diaspora. And in fact, I even have his autograph lying somewhere in my dad's basement, if that tells you anything at all about his popularity at the time. And a little bit maybe of my background as well. But anyway, his usage of this social bandit identity and the imagery of the Haiduks harkens back to the migrations of 1690, and not to mention the invocation of terms like Ustasha, which conjure images of the Second World War. And so, to be sure, the Krajina Republic comes to an end in 1995 with the Croatian Operation Storm. And roughly 2,000 ethnic Serbs were expelled from Croatian territory, those sort of two red globs we saw in the previous map. Roughly 2,000 ethnic Serbs from Croatia are expelled. Countless Serbs loaded onto ox carts and tractors, and they took with them, the basic belongings like most refugees and migrants would. They emptied their homes, and whatever they left behind was essentially looted. Most homes were burned or given to Croatian refugees in return. And the Croatian Serbs later on first headed to Banja Luka in Bosnia, then to Belgrade, and then eventually most often settling in Europe, North America, and Australia. And so the effects then of this sort of Serbian identity then in Croatia, we see from these two examples of census data. From 1991 at the start of the war to 2011, about a decade after the war, the Yugoslav wars as a whole ended. And so we see this demographic change. And so since 2011, the Croatian state has pretty much gone to pains to further reduce the existence of Serbs in Croatia, or at least to make their lives even more difficult. They've attempted to enact a law, for example, which prohibited the use of Cyrillic. Initially, as well, in 1991, they relegated Serbs to an ethnic minority rather than keeping them as a constituent people of the state. And even on an unofficial level, random beatings and attacks and harassments occur occasionally. So for example, just last summer in 2019, in two villages just outside of the former capital, Knin, former Serbian Krajina capital, Knin, in two villages, pubs were attacked during a football match, during a soccer match. People were sitting at the pub watching a Serbian soccer game, And these masked bandits basically came in and started, looting and beating people. And so at best, it's difficult for Serbs to return to their homes that they've lived in since about the 17th century. At worst, it's impossible. So it's really this sort of impossible position that the ethnic Serbs with this unique identity have been left. And so where does this leave us essentially? So in some instances previously, I've argued in other presentations, such as in looking at Bosnia, that memories of events similar to or the same as the migration of the Serbs or the Second World War or other such memories would further lead to armed conflict and violence between the various ethnic groups of the former Yugoslavia. However, in this instance, I think the Croatian Serb population has become so minor and so minuscule in relation to the overall Croatian population that it's near impossible for any semblance of organization against the Croatian state. It would take something of a larger scale war, such as perhaps we saw in the 1990s, or even the influence of outside actors, such as the Wagner group, which is currently operating in the Donbass in Ukraine, and is populated actually by Serbian veterans of the Yugoslav Wars of Succession, in order for anything of real effect to come to pass here in Croatia. But in a region seemingly perpetually in flux, and which still has political leaders who are personally involved in the nationalist wars of the 1990s, anything is possible. So one point that I would like to make here is that until a real national and ethnic dialogue, which is informed by the past, and until those in power end their political games with the locals, these underlying tensions are going to remain. So thank you for joining me for this talk today.
Okay, Simon, thanks very much. You're not gonna play us some Turbo Folk? You're through a little early, but
it's tempting, but
yeah. Okay, that's fine. Thanks. We'll move along then to the third presenter in today's panel. This is Dr. James Horncastle, who introduced me, so now I get to return the favor. James Horncastle is an assistant professor and holder of the Edward and Emily McWhinney Professorship in International Relations at Simon Fraser University. His recent manuscript, The Macedonian Slavs in the Greek Civil War, 1949, examines how the Macedonian Slavs' participation in the conflict and the attempts by other groups to manipulate them gave rise to modern issues that continue to affect politics in the region today. His research interests include refugee and migration studies, international relations, history of modern Greece, and Yugoslav studies. His paper today is entitled Recreating the Past, a historiography of the People's Republic of Macedonia in 1945-1991. So James, over to you, please.
Thank you for the introduction there, Julian. While the Democratic Army of Greece's defeat in the Greek Civil War was a traumatic result for the Communist Party leadership, it was equally, if not more so, for the Macedonian members of the organization. Key elements of Greece's Macedonian population viewed the victory of the left after the oppression experienced under Metaxas and the occupation authorities as the only means for their long-term survival in the country. With the Democratic Army of Greece's defeat, a significant portion of the Macedonian population, fearing retribution, fled Greece for the People's Republic of Macedonia. In the decades to follow, the refugee population would integrate itself into the population, and critically, many pursued academic positions in the state. It is from these positions of influence that the former refugees would overcome the trauma of their forced expulsion from the Greek state by creating a narrative that continues to have political ramifications to the present. By the end of the First World War, Macedonians living in Greece already felt alienated from the Greek state. In the aftermath of the Asia Minor campaign and the Treaty of Lausanne confirmed their status as, at best, second-class citizens. Immediately after the Balkan Wars, the Greek government's refusal to recognize a Slavic identity in northern Greece and attempts to actively eliminate this identity caused an estimated 127,000 Slavic-speaking individuals to leave Greece for Bulgaria between 1913 and 1928. This number represented a significant decline in the percentage of Slavic-speaking individuals in Greece. Nevertheless, the Greek government's solution to the Asia Minor catastrophe and the necessity of settling 1.5 million Anatolian Greek refugees in the country created an even greater shift in the Macedonian question. As Elizabeth Kontoyori noted in Population Exchange in Greek Macedonia, one of the Greek government's principal reasons for settling Asia Minor refugees in northern Greece, in particular the border hinterlands, was that it feared for the security of the northern territories. In addressing the issue of the Slavic minority in this manner, the various Greek governments went well beyond securing its frontiers and, in the process, created the potential for a fifth column that they had actively worked to prevent. The Greek state in the interwar period failed to integrate and indeed managed to further alienate the Macedonian population of Greece. The living conditions of the Macedonians within Greece further deteriorated when Metaxas seized control of the country on 4 August 1936. Metaxas rose to power with anti-communist pretenses in a country and period that associated Slavism with communism. As a result, Metaxas fully enforced new laws concerning the use of the Slavic, i.e. Macedonian language, and the practice of Slavic culture. These laws were even more restricted than the laws passed by previous Greek administrations to assimilate the Macedonian population. Nevertheless, as Philip Karabot notes, although historians often blame Metaxas for alienating the Macedonians, there was considerable ideological overlap between Metaxas and the interwar Greek governments. Quite simply, Metaxas reinforced the alienation of the Macedonians rather than creating it himself. Due to the various Greek governments' policies, the Macedonians did not identify with Greece by the time the Axis powers occupied the country in 1941. A sizable minority of Greece's Macedonian population, therefore, were willing to listen to any promises for a better existence than the one they had under the Greek state. It was this sentiment that the leftist forces in Greece, first the Greek Communist Party and later their benefactors, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, exploited. Initially, the Macedonians in Greece enjoyed considerable autonomy in their nation-building exercise, specifically between 1945 and 1947. Ultimately, however, the Macedonians lost all agency in their dealing with the Greek Communist Party, in part due to Yugoslav Communist Party no longer willing to be their benefactor. The defeat of the Greek Communists in 1949 resulted in the majority of the Macedonians who fought for the Democratic Army of Greece fleeing the country, with a significant portion of these individuals settling in what was then the People's Republic of Macedonia. As Iakovos Michailidis notes, Macedonian refugees from Greece entered the academic discipline in disproportionate numbers. Risto Kyriazovsky, Christo Antonovsky, Todor Simovsky, and Kruste Vitovsky, all amongst the leading historians of the People's Republic of Macedonia during the Cold War, were born in the Greek state. The focus of these scholars was on the recent past, specifically the Slavic population of Ottoman Macedonia before it was divided by the Balkan nation states. Michailidis argues these individuals, under state pressure, deliberately constructed an image of the past that differs from reality as part of the Macedonian nation-building exercise. Where Michailidis errs in his conclusions, however, is why these historians, and several others besides, reach their conclusions. Michailidis, while acknowledging that these individuals suffered in their forced expulsion from Greece, then disregards this point and argues that state influence was paramount in their works. What needs emphasis, however, is the fact that their forced migration created a sense of longing and crisis of identity amongst these academics that writing and research could help resolve. Linda Camino and Ruth Krulfeld in Reconstructing Lives, Recapturing Meaning, Refugee Identity, Gender and Culture Change, note that in the case of refugees, this very plasticity of refugee and ethnic identity may be crucial because it allows the experience of suffering and hardship to assimilate into symbolic understandings of who the collective ethnic group is and what it stands for. What differs in the experience of the Macedonian refugees from Greece compared to many other refugee groups is that they fled to a territory that recognized them as one of their own. Kyriazovsky's works, as Jovanovic notes, display a deep nostalgia for the past. Given that Kyriazovsky fought during the Greek Civil War and was attempting to create the idealized Macedonian state, The nostalgia he displayed was for a Macedonian never realized. Writing about it, however, allowed him to recapture something he and other Macedonians had lost. This tendency was replicated by other writers. Simovsky, for example, dedicated one of his works to, quote, the tens of thousands of my compatriots who gave their lives for national and social freedom, end quote, simultaneously counting themselves lucky while idealizing the past before their expulsion. These and other authors use history as a tool to overcome the pain of the past. Outsiders, particularly in Greece, see their publications on the plight of the Macedonian population in Greece as part of a campaign to destabilize the country. It is undeniable that the Macedonian state, as part of its nation-building exercise, sought to cultivate an image of an idyllic past in Ottoman Macedonia that was stripped away by the competing nation states. Nevertheless, the agency of these academics, who as refugees had lost their homeland and were forced to integrate into another state, needs to be taken into consideration. Although an exact balancing of which imperative drove their writing and an emphasis on the continuity of the Macedonian nation is impossible to discern, the role of their trauma as refugees needs to be accounted for in analyses of Macedonian historiography. These writings, due to their romanticization of the past, have fueled considerable discord in the present. Although the writing of these scholars was arguably a personal exercise to explain their origins and why they now lived in a country not of their birth, it was easily interpreted by outsiders as revisionism and part of Macedonian aspirations for northern Greece, especially in the wake of Yugoslavia's collapse in the 1990s. Furthermore, Macedonian politicians, particularly in the former ruling party of Vimro, openly encouraged some of these interpretations. While the signing of the Precipice Accords in 2019 has nominally normalized relations between Greece and now North Macedonia, the writings of Kyriazovsky and others continue to cast a shadow over interstate relations in the region. While Macedonian historiography has commonly been portrayed as a means of the state to pursue irredentist and nation-building activities, for those writing it, the process was a much more personal experience. After being forcibly displaced, individuals like Kyriazovsky, Antonovsky, and the others sought to justify and explain their experience of displacement. Belonging to part of a broader Macedonian whole, and having that taken away from them by the competing nation states, became a means of explaining this development. As this argument also played into the ongoing Macedonian question, however, the rationale behind the stance is always assumed to be political, rather than a combination of political and the personal experiences of the scholars involved. Thank you.
Okay, James, thanks very much. Thank you to all of our panelists, and we are done very well time-wise. We're actually a little ahead of schedule, so we should have plenty of time for question and answer, and certainly see common themes here of violent displacement and the ongoing negotiation of memory and identity. Our panelists are all there. Could I ask all of you, invite all of you to turn your cameras on right now for the question and answer session. And to the audience, please raise your hand, and I'll try to find you in the participants roster. You're also welcome to type questions in the question and answer box, which you can also find at the bottom of your screen. So I've got a couple of things, a couple of questions I have, but I could save those for later if we see questions coming up, hands being raised. I'll just give you all a moment here, and please turn your cameras on so we can see you all. Okay, well, I guess I could get things started off here. Maybe one question for each of you. Lauren, just first off, in your paper, you noticed that I was surprised when you said this. Surprised to read it, that the historiography, the voices of children, have tended to be faint, peripheral, of non-existence, non-existent. That rather surprised me. Can you get a sense of why this is, and is this a similar phenomenon in the study of other genocides and other historiographies?
Thanks, Julian. It's a good question. I'm most familiar with the Holocaust historiography so I'll speak mostly to that. I think one of the reasons that children have tended to be more peripheral than adult survivors is simply because it took them a lot longer to get to the point where they were ready to share what had happened to them. And in some cases, you know, they weren't really able even to verbalize to themselves what had happened until they were quite a bit older. And by then there was an established historiography of survivor memoirs. And there's a real sort of, based on my discussions with child survivors, there was a real sort of tension between camp survivors and child survivors, as if somehow their experience of genocide was less because they hadn't been in camps, or it was just qualitatively different because they were children. And I'm still sort of beginning my broader research into the subject of child survivors of trauma and genocide, but my sense is that because they're children, the approach to their identity formation and their memory is different and somehow more malleable, less fixed, needs to be put into a different category than older survivors, where those points are much more fixed and in that sense, perhaps much more affected, much more shattered, the way the Capra meant. And so there are these circumstances that have militated against the inclusion of the children, of the voices of children, but also the voices of survivors generally, which are simply have been regarded for a long time as less reliable than official documentation, all of which is produced by perpetrators as well, right?
Right.
So memoirs have tended to be their own category and not often integrated into the mainstream sort of historical narratives of the event. But as I said, that's started to change in the last couple of decades. Historians have become less suspicious of subjectivity and the lack of reliability, for lack of a better word, because of the other sort of really valuable components that these stories bring us.
Thank you. I was also quite struck by, you mentioned when Marie gives talks to high schools. It's just almost, she switches back to being Mariette. Just 20 years ago, I was teaching high school and we had a Holocaust survivor come in and tell his story. And he told me privately after, he said, I can only do that maybe 4 times a year. It's that difficult for him. I'm just wondering, have you watched Mariette give a presentation to a high school class? And I'm just wondering how it went and how she found it.
Yeah, I have. That's actually how I met her, because
okay.
It's something that she does through the Vancouver Holocaust Education
Right.
Center, and I was brought on a few years ago as the historian who gives the lecture for context just before the survivor speaks
Right.
about their story. So I met her by actually having to being able to and privileged to listen to her story, and I've since heard her, I think 3 or 4 more times, as well as other survivors. I think I've done 12 lectures at this point. So it's been a real treat, and it really was apparent right from the beginning that she went in as one person, and once she was on stage telling her story, she really did become different. And it's only as I've gotten to know her better that I can see more clearly the differences. And as soon as she gets off the stage, she goes straight home and goes to bed, I think she says, for like 12 hours, because she just finds it exhausting. And there's a real emotional and physical gearing up as well to get up there. She says she's still sick every time she does it, even though she's been doing it now for decades. And so there's a real sort of, it's another method of survival, I think, to be able to take Mariette off and put her away when she's not required to speak in front of an audience. So I'm one of the very few people who has to figure out in any given conversation almost whether I'm talking to Marie or Mariette. She's been very patient with me and sort of left it up to me to decide who she is. But it's been tricky to navigate and to sort of try and respect her boundaries, which have become quite a bit permeable.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. Thank you. And please, I think we'll speak on behalf of all of us to thank her for continuing to offer to give this gift of this memory, her memories, to especially to high school students, and to the community. And thanks to you for helping keeping her memory alive. Okay. maybe I'll continue on around here, and then please get some other questions from the audience. Stefan, maybe over to you. You mentioned I was looking this up earlier, just before your talk, with the in 1995, the Croatian community, the Croatian Serb community, was shattered by the events of the Croatian government offensive. And I think even now, although you mentioned some people have returned, most have, and I think the numbers I think you showed us were effectively down about 2/3 from what they were in the early 1990s. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the identity of this community, that it is so displaced. And I think I was also struck, you mentioned early on, that this is a very separate identity, say from I guess, for lack of a better, a mainstream Serbian identity. And I mean, speaking of personal experience, I was actually in Belgrade and in London in 1995. And I expected Belgraders I talked to feel some empathy for the Croatian Serbs, and many of them were just as you talk about frontiersmen. Their attitude was almost as I remember one person said, "Oh, they can't drive very well. We're constantly having accidents with them in the city and so forth." And I was rather surprised at this lack of lack of solidarity. And I think presently there's under 200,000, if I'm not mistaken, Serbians living in Croatia. So I just want, where, in terms of the identity politics or identity today with this community that seems very much, and there's a diaspora, there's communities across Europe, obviously North America, Australia, etc. Where is it all today?
Yeah, thank you, Julian. Yeah, so I mean, of course, there's quite a spread of people, and so we have to sort of talk in generalities, right? That's the caveat, right? But essentially, those who still remain very much want to protect their identities. And so, we see a lot of movements to sort of raise funds, for example, to restore churches. And I follow some of these groups on Facebook, for example. So, some of it is anecdotal, but you do see it from time to time. So, they very much hold to the sort of Orthodox Christmas, on January 7th, as opposed to December 25th. And things like that. And in a lot of ways, it seems as though the identity has been further entrenched. And so the sort of ethnic nationalism has gotten stronger, which, in a lot of ways, I think is almost like a coping mechanism, to be the minority within this republic. And so it's a survival technique, I think, in some ways. But, in a lot of other ways too, it's almost like a doubling down, because, as we know, everyone always kind of talks about the negative sides of nationalism. And, of course, we tend to, Jamie and I studying nationalism and things, I think quite often we tend to ignore the positive sides of nationalism, or forget about it. But, really that sort of doubling down on the ethnic identity is almost putting it into a stark contrast, right? It's sort of like we heard in the keynote there, where, rather than trying to sort of disappear into the society, they're almost trying to, state their claim in the society.
Okay, and just you mentioned that some veterans are in the Wagner group. Is this carrying on? You talk about carrying on. Are there younger generations doing the same thing, or is this just mostly men in their 40s and I guess would be almost in their 50s now who were veterans of the war?
Yeah, as far as I've seen, there's one guy who has since gone sort of quiet. And now that was because they targeted his social media platforms because he was quite brazen about it. But he very much was a veteran of the 1990s wars. I haven't seen so much from the youth. If anything, it's gone the other way with the youth, where they're sort of more resigned, I guess, to the fact that they are in fact a minority, rather than, you know, sort of becoming aggressive about it, let's say, which, you know, as you know, Julian, is a contrast to, you know, say, for example, the interwar period where, you know, we had, you know, youth movements, and, you know, talking about effects of the First World War amongst these youth that never experienced the First World War, for example. So, you know, it's very much a contrast. And I think that's why we may not see quite the same levels of violence in Croatia as we might say, for example, in Bosnia or in other places in the Balkans.
Yeah, because of sort of the image and what I've heard in I guess mainstream global media is that it's a very old population that is left there. But yeah, there are obviously some younger people, and there's all and politicians who there was you mentioned the violence last year, but there was also, I think, a reflaying where a Croatian politicians came and a Serbian Croatian and a Croatian politician were both trying to transcend this. So yeah, there's good news there too. But I think, yeah, since Madeleine Albright visited about 20 years ago, I don't think there's been too much in the sort of larger global media. I've got a question for Jamie, but why don't we go to we've got some hand raised. Sergio, would you like to come in with your question, please?
Yes, can we step back to Lauren a few seconds? I'm sorry, I was late.
Absolutely.
I was wondering if you might spend a few more words about your method. Basically, I'm extremely interested in knowing if you're taping the interviews with her, for example, if you are aiming at a documentary in addition to a book, in addition to a monograph, for example.
Yeah. I am taping the interviews only to save myself from having to type or handwrite everything, but it's with a very clear understanding that they're only for me, that they're to go nowhere else. And we've developed a kind of it's been very tricky, but we've developed a very close personal relationship as this has unfolded, so that she's confided in me about some parts of her life that I know she really wouldn't want, definitely not the public to hear, and certainly members of her family as well. I think I mentioned 8 of her 11 siblings survived. I didn't have time to talk about the impact that the trauma had on the relationship between those siblings, but it's been very severe. And I'm sort of cognizant of, you know, 4 of the siblings are still alive, and I'm writing her story and not this larger family history. And there's certainly been questions about who owns whose story, shall we say. So this is why she has always said, this is my truth and I'm going to tell my truth, and they individually each have their truths because they're also survivors. So the methodology has really been in many ways dictated by my subject, which I know puts me in a sort of tenuous position as a historian where I'm supposed to be in charge, but those were sort of the terms that we entered into the project on. And I'm very much, in fact, simply giving her voice, putting her voice onto the page, as it were. So my presence as a historian is quite minimal. I suspect down the road I'll do more with it, but I might wait until I feel less constrained by her family circumstance, and I've done more research with other child survivors and with the historiography, so that it's much less about her and much more about this broader, really important topic of child survivors of genocide. But thank you. That's a good question, and I've been thinking about it as I've been working. Where is my voice going to end up being? Will I have a voice at all? And really, at this point, it's mostly Mariette's voice.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions coming up? Okay, well, I can turn to my questions for James then. James, you mentioned this politicization, of course, the influence of the influence that's within the official historical community, the state historians in Skopje being heavily represented by this by the refugees of 48. This community that moved north and of course move elsewhere. And I mean, I was struck by this when I visited Skopje, lived there for a while too. There's a prominent statue, the Children of 48, and every year there's a celebration. And I think it was 1998, there was an attempt by a group of some from Toronto who wanted to go and sort of almost physically go to the towns in northern Greece, all of which have Slavic Macedonian names. Of course, there's a sort of a map there's a map under a map there, and they wanted to go to Edessa, which they call Vodin, the town of the waterfalls. But even though some of them had Canadian passports, they were prevented. So I was just wondering if you know of similar or similar events going on. Have they been able to get into Greece? I mean, I hear stories sometimes about through media, some anthropologists, about how sometimes diaspora will come back to an ancestral village somewhere around Kastoria, and they will have get out the Macedonian flags and so forth, and and then of course then they'll leave and go back to Toronto or Melbourne and leave their relatives to mend fences with their Greek neighbors. I just wonder if you could maybe bring us up to that. I mean, how much are these? Do you still hear about these sorts of things taking place? And is it still? I mean, although there's the shift, of course, from the socialist Yugoslavia to the Republic of Macedonia, but many of those historians stayed in their position and continue to publish and have a heavy influence on state pedagogy in the public school curriculum.
Yeah, so for the first part of your question with regards to are basically diaspora able to end up returning, especially if they have different passports, there was actually a notable conference actually in 2015 that was actually in Kastoria that was hosted. It was mainly Macedonian academics, but also ended up serving as a large gathering for the diaspora, basically talking about the evolution of Macedonian identity. In part, the reason I think that it was in Kastoria is that several of the opinions kind of voiced at that conference kind of run counter to the official narratives that you kind of really have to adhere to within now what would be North Macedonia. So basically Greece almost served as a little bit of an escape from the official narrative. That said, many in the diaspora treated this is basically Macedonians going back to Greece. Let's go have our conference, or let's go here and celebrate Macedonian identity, as you said, making sure that you bring up the red flag with the Vrina sun instead of the blue flag with the Vrina sun. Just, you got to play up some of the politics. So what actually ended up beginning by Macedonian academics as a way of kind of escaping some of the nationalist rhetoric within the North Macedonia turned into actually a nationalist event and gathering for basically diaspora to express their Macedonian nationalism. And that's actually one of the major kind of complaints that ends up existing with Macedonian academics, is that they're being heavily influenced by the diaspora. These diaspora communities, fairly wealthy in comparison. As you said, there's a large community in Toronto. There's also a large community in Melbourne as well. And they tend to end up propping up VMRO a lot in some of the official narratives. In terms of the political and kind of academic situation within the Republic of North Macedonia, there hasn't been, at least from what I've seen so far, a big kind of shift in terms of the academic trends once VMRO ended up losing the election. Many of the individuals are still relatively ingrained within the system and basically kind of trying to sabotage any kind of shift in some of the narratives. We'll see if VMRO remains out of power for a bit longer. You may end up having perhaps a bit more of an opening with regards to some of these kind of ideological constructs. But at the time, I'm not completely convinced at this stage. We'll have to see in the future.
Okay, thanks. I've got a question in the chat for Stefan. How identities of the diaspora are influencing the relationships back home, and how they are remembering, reconstructing these events.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, of course, there's a sort of interplay between, the sort of identities abroad and the identities at home, I guess, if I could put it that way. And, much like Jamie was just saying too, in terms of, sort of causing mayhem, I guess, in a way, when they return. And so, very much as we saw, from the post-Second World War migrants and refugees to the diaspora, we see a lot of the sort of sentiments remaining and holding over from the 1990s. You know, the sort of victim identities or victimology, as well as, you know, like, it's a harsh word, but, you know, realistically, the sort of hatred as well towards Croats and even Bosnian Muslims. And so, you know, necessarily then there is that sort of interplay, but I think amongst the Croatian Serb population in Croatia, it's closer to a sort of resignation, something closer to a sort of live and let live kind of sort of dynamic. You know, I mean, they're the ones who have to live on a daily basis in these areas. You know, they're the ones who are going to have to go to the markets every single week and, you know, be seen even in the towns, right? And, you know, they can't go around sort of, you know, displaying their nationalist tattoos or something like that, or, you know, unfurling the nationalist flags like in the former Yugoslav Republic of North Macedonia. So yeah, so I mean, it informs, but you know, each sort of relationship sort of informs the other, but at the same time too, there is this kind of clash of the two communities. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that actually sounds similar to the Macedonian Slavs of northern Greece. Maybe
Right.
you and James,
Yeah.
there's a future paper for you, perhaps. We have a question from Demetrius,
I've got
please.
nothing to
do. Thanks to all the panelists for really interesting papers. My question is for Jamie on, and following up on the thread of the personal is the political in a way that is coming up here and that you seem to bring forward. You mentioned the Prespes Accord and of course the recognition by Greece of a Northern Macedonian state. Is it possible to do a study, or do you know if it has been done, of the political personnel that participated on both sides, both the Greek side and the Macedonian side, in these accords, and trace family relationships and connections of either Greek or, because I mean, Syriza has a communist party genealogy within it, even if it is not a direct successor of the Communist Party of Greece. And of course, on the Macedonian side, of the political personnel, the Macedonian side, is it possible to trace origins of political personnel in the participants of the Civil War? Greek communists who may have had family next to Slavic soldiers of the Democratic Army in the north, and vice versa?
I think it's certainly possible. I actually haven't seen anybody that's done so yet. It's actually something I've been intrigued about a little bit myself. In terms of the actual process of kind of charting it, the individuals involved are fairly expressive about their background, but the majority of them were either born in Greece or born in North Macedonia. There's not so much actually said directly about where you originally, say, from family that was originally in Greece. You would have to do a little bit more background research in order to kind of tease that out. It's certainly possible. The archives in Greece, I feel much more confident in being able to kind of tease out some of these and do the research. In terms of the Republic of North Macedonia, research there is still a little bit problematic, to be honest, because the individuals from Vimro still kind of guard some of the personal records. The advantage is that many of the individuals are kind of public personalities, especially the non-Vimro ones. It'd be if they were willing to discuss some of their background and things like that. I can't see any reason why they wouldn't be, because they're the ones really kind of trying to push to challenge some of these narratives. So could it be done? Yes, it would just require a little bit of kind of non-traditional research in order to tease it out.
It's basically oral histories with living political personnel similarly, with it would be interesting to actually have interviews of the academic personnel and their experiences.
Yeah, actually, going back to some of the negotiations that went on during the 1990s between Greece and then the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. I actually interviewed Evangelos Kofos, who basically comes from fairly right-wing background, some of his politics as well. And you could see that kind of playing out in negotiations because he was actually dealing with it. But the interesting thing that he told me in terms of what ended up sabotaging the negotiations in the 90s was actually concerns within Greece over the role of the diaspora in the elections. From kind of his like internal model, was basically many of the diaspora would probably end up blocking some of these. So it's interesting, that's something that still needs to be teased out as well. As you said, the personalities involved in the 90s, and then try to compare that to the personalities that happened at Precipice as well. Does that answer your question? Yeah, perfect.
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple minutes left here. Are there any other questions or in the Q&A or coming up? Raise your hand or last call here for questions, please. Should ask the panelists if you have any questions for one another. Okay then. Well, I make it 4:27, so that's we can conclude our panel just a little bit early here. So my thanks to all of the panelists this afternoon for the most interesting papers, and thank you for sharing your research and in the Q&A, and for the questions from the audience. And on that, I think we'll sign off for the time being. We will ask you to be back for the next panel starting at 4:45. And yeah, I guess that's all for me for now. Jamie, is there anything else anything else to add there?
I think you got it all there, Julian. That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so please reconvene at 4:45, please. Thanks.